Hello, everybody. I'm Liza Dunn. I am the Medical Affairs Lead for Bayer Crop Science, and we are delighted today to introduce you to Dr. Eric Brodsky, the Associate Director at the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research and Labeling Policy Team. Dr. Brodsky will be presenting today an overview on prescribing information and how labeling works. And so we're looking very much forward to this discussion. Please feel free to enter questions in the chat if you have any questions or the Q&A questions during the webinar. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over. Welcome, Dr. Brodsky.
Great. Thanks for that. Thanks for everyone for attending. Let me share my slides. So let me give you a little bit of background. My name is Eric Brodsky. I work at the FDA. Prior to coming to the FDA, I was a primary care physician in the Washington, D.C. area. And as part of the labeling policy team, we work with all of the prescription drug review divisions in CDER, that's the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. We have 24 different therapeutic areas. So I work to improve prescription drug labeling. And so most of our work is internal. We provide labeling training to folks. We provide resources. We develop policies such as writing guidances. FDA guidances represent our current thinking on a topic. And typically what happens is when we publish the guidance, we receive comments from the public and we analyze those comments and we update and revise guidances. And today I'm here to talk to you about prescription drug labeling. So here's my disclaimer. So here are the topics I'm going to present today. I'm going to talk about different types of prescription drug labeling. I think we're all relatively familiar with the prescribing information, but there are other types of prescription drug labeling, such as carton container labeling and FDA approved patient labeling. We'll talk about the purpose of the prescribing information. The prescribing information is for the healthcare practitioner, for the physician, could be an emergency room physician, medical toxicologist, also for the pharmacist, nurse practitioners, physician assistant. So it's a wide range of folks. This document is geared to healthcare practitioners, people who treat patients. We'll talk about how the prescribing information is developed and reviewed. And this group particularly wanted me to talk about specific requirements and recommendations about specific sections of the prescribing information, including the box warning, also known as the black box warning, the warnings and precautions section, adverse reactions, drug abuse and dependence, and the overdosage section of labeling. And finally, we'll talk about prescription drug labeling resources. So with respect to types of prescription drug labeling, I talked about carton and container labeling. This is an example of a container label. It's a fictitious example. And as you know, carton container labeling are particularly important for appropriate dispensation, administration, and preparation of the drug. They're important to very important that we develop this to reduce medication errors, because a lot of medication errors have happened about inappropriate selection of the correct drug on the pharmacy shelf. Thus, we're particularly concerned about what we call the principal display panel. That's the part of the carton or the container that is typically seen by the end user. Now, the end user for carton container labeling could be the patient who's using the product. Potentially, it's an auto injector and the patient's using it, so they'll see it. It could be the caregiver for the patient. Let's say the patient is a young someone, a neonate or a child, and the parent is administering the product. It could be the pharmacist who's pulling it off the shelf, or it could be the physician who is administering the product. For example, a radiologist may administer a radiopharmaceutical for imaging purposes, and they receive the product. So it depends upon the end user, depends upon the specific drug. Very important to include the proprietary name of the drug if there is one, the non-proprietary name of the drug. Sometimes we refer to that as the generic name of the drug for drug products, or proper name for biological products. The strength, in this situation, we have a double expression of strength. The route of administration, cautionary or warning statements, controlled substance symbol if the product is a controlled substance. So that's the key area of the carton and container labeling, something known as the principal display panel. And I cite a guidance that provides recommendations primarily to industry about how to develop the carton and container labeling. So moving on to the second big group of type of prescription drug labeling, FDA approved patient labeling, and there are three main types. One is the medication guide, and on subsequent slides, we'll talk about the PPI, or the patient package insert, and also the third type, the instructions for use. So this is an example of a medication guide. And a medication guide may be required by the FDA to potentially prevent serious risks of a product. So most drugs don't have medication guides, some do. Medication guides have specific dispensation and distribution requirements so that each patient who receives the drug at the pharmacy receives a medication guide every time they receive a prescription. So, and this is, if you notice at the bottom, it says it's been approved by the FDA, and it gives the date. The next slide, this slide right here is, as I stated earlier, is a patient package insert. It's also known at the top, patient information. It's very similar to the medication guide. In this situation, it's required for only 3 situations. These are estrogen-containing products, oral contraceptives, and drugs that are approved for a condition only based on animal studies. And we have several, about 10 of those approved in the United States. That's, for example, anthrax is a case where obviously these are situations where it would be unethical to study the drug in humans. There are also some drugs approved for hematological side effects from radiation exposure. That's another example of drugs approved under the animal rule. So in these situations, these are required PPIs, and they have similar distribution requirements and dispensation requirements as I mentioned for medication guides. Most other PPIs are not required. They're voluntarily submitted, reviewed, and approved by the FDA. So those PPIs don't have distribution and dispensation requirements as these specific ones I referred to. Finally, the third main category for FDA-approved patient labeling is a critical piece of labeling, or instructions for use. So these are only, we basically approve IFUs only for those drugs that have complicated use instructions. So if you take a tablet once per day, it won't typically have an instructions for use. But if you need to reconstitute a lyophilized powder, if you need to reconstitute an oral solution at home, if you have an auto injector, if you need to prepare a product through a vial and then a syringe, it's going to have instructions for use with nice pictures, and has detailed text and pictures about how to prepare, how to use, store, dispose the product. And we have a guidance for industry that provides recommendations to industry about how to develop instructions for use. So the third main category of prescription drug labeling is the prescribing information, and that's the focus of today's discussion. This is written for healthcare practitioners. I should say earlier, FDA-approved patient labeling is written at or below the national reading level. So the national reading level is about a 7th grader, maybe a 6th grader. So we write instructions for use, PPIs, and medication guides for someone reading at a 5th grade level or a 6th grade level. In contrast, the prescribing information is written for the learned healthcare practitioner, and the oncologist, the endocrinologist, the intensive care unit nurse, people who are used to understanding complex medical information. So we use medical related terms. So the prescribing information must include a summary of the essential scientific information needed for the safe and effective use of the drug. It's not all the information about the drug. Sometimes an applicant may do 5 studies, but we only may discuss 3 studies. We may only discuss certain parts of the studies that are essential for the scientific information to need to use the drug safely and effectively. Another example are generic drugs. For example, generic drugs, one of the key studies they do are bioequivalence studies. They look at exposure of the generic drug compared to what we call the reference listed drug, also known as the innovator. And that's the key studies. So these are pharmacokinetic studies. However, we do not include that information in the labeling because we don't believe that's essential for the healthcare practitioner to use the drug. So not all studies done are included in the labeling, only those essential ones. Information and labeling must be informative and must be accurate, and it must be updated when there's new information that causes the labeling to be inaccurate, false, or misleading. So after approval, and we'll talk about it later, the information labeling changes over time. It's not if if a product was approved in 1980, over time that changes. There's new scientific information. There are new studies. So it changes over time. So the prescribing information, there are 2 types of prescribing information. On the left-hand side, this is what we call the old format prescribing information or non-physician labeling rule format. As you notice, the sections, this is the order of the sections. And now let me show you, and this is from a 1979 rule. So the new format, which was the rule came out in 2006, is called the physician labeling rule format because it was geared to physicians and other healthcare practitioners. The PLR format has 3 different sections: the highlights, which is the first, the table of contents, and the full prescribing information. So the 1979 old format labeling sections were developed. As you noticed here, the penultimate section is the dosage and administration section. However, the DNA section of labeling, dosage administration, is one of the most important sections for healthcare practitioners, although it's the second to last section here. In the PLR format, we move it to section 2. Notice the precautions section of old format labeling has a lot of disparate information. It's got information about use in specific populations like geriatric patients, pediatric patients, pregnant patients, breastfeeding patients. It's got drug interaction information and information to patients. So what we did within the 2006 rule, we moved that stuff to its own individual section or subsections. So for example, in old format 1979, there is no drug interaction section, but now we have section 7, a whole new drug interaction section to concentrate that information. Information on specific populations was moved to section 8. We have animal study information, which was moved to section 13, and information for healthcare practitioners to tell patients is in section 17. So you could see how the changes were done from 1979 to 2006. Notice that, as I stated earlier, section 2, dosage administration, is number 2 because it's relatively important. Previously, if the box warning wasn't included, the description section was the first section that potentially could include the chemical, the structure, a picture of the molecule, as well as the structural formula, and that was moved to section 11. Notice that there's numbered sections and those numbered sections do not change. So if you're a pediatrician, the pediatricians go to their homes subsection, which is the pediatric use subsection 8.4. If you're a geriatrician, you go to subsection 8.5. If you want to know about overdosage, you go to section 10. So we have these two formats. So over time, the percentage of PLR format has increased over the years. This is due to several reasons. Number one, we've approved new drugs. When new drugs are required to be in the PLR format, we've approved new indications, new dosage regimens for older drugs, and those labeling are required to be in PLR. We've also had what we call voluntary PLR conversions. Applicants have voluntarily submitted and converted old format to PLR format. We've had over 250 of these approved, which is great. We've increased the number of labeling with PLR format. I should say these are under applications known as new drug applications and biologics license applications. So these are the innovator drugs. The generic drugs generally have a lower percentage of labeling in PLR format. So how is the prescribing information developed and reviewed? So the prescribing information is initially developed by the company. Sometimes companies develop proposed prescribing information the first time they believe that the drug could be used in humans. The first time a human's going to be use the drug. Companies, as you know, work with many regulatory agencies. The United States is one. The European Union, the British has a regulatory agency. Canada, Japan, and other countries. A company typically develops something called a core data sheet, which is what they believe to represent the drug. And from that, they develop the prescribing information for the United States. There are other formats and other content for labeling for other regulatory areas, and they'll develop that as well. As the labeling gets along, the applicant may communicate to the FDA. It could be a meeting, it could be a question, and they may ask FDA to comment on certain aspects of the labeling. A common question is, if we do these studies with these endpoints, with these statistical analyses, can we get these claims? Can we get could we present this information in the labeling? When the applicant is ready, they'll submit an application to approve a drug in the United States, or they can have a supplement application. So a supplement application are for those drugs that are already approved in the United States, and this is an additional indication or additional use. So for example, a drug may be approved in asthma in adults, and subsequently they'll come in and ask for the drug to be approved in a new population, such as pediatric patients. They conducted additional studies, so they'll submit a supplement to that application. So as part of the requirement for the application or supplement, they'll submit a proposed labeling, a proposed prescribing information. I should also note they'll submit proposed card and container labeling, as well as FDA or as well as patient labeling if applicable. As I stated earlier, not all drugs have patient labeling. All drugs have a card or container labeling. All drugs have a prescribing information. We're talking about prescription drugs. So after the prescribing information is submitted, there is active review by the FDA, and we have active communication with the applicant. We may have over 100 comments on the labeling. So this is an active iterative process between first internally at the FDA and then subsequently discussions with the applicant. To give you an idea of the folks in the FDA that review labeling, I'm presenting that here. And the different colors represent different offices in the FDA. We have clinicians. Typically, you have clinicians in in the field. So, for example, if you have a drug for diabetes, you'll have diabetologists, endocrinologists review that. If you have a drug for heart failure, you'll have cardiologists review that, or people in the cardiology field. You'll also have people who look at animal studies, pharmacology, toxicology, people who look at the level of the blood, um, level of the drug in the blood. Those are clinical pharmacologists. If the product is an anti-infective, antimicrobial, we'll have clinical microbiologists. If there's pediatric information, we'll get the pediatricians involved. Similarly, we have certain requirements for pregnancy, lactation in females or reproductive potential. We will ask obstetricians or people in that field to get involved. We have medication error specialists, product quality specialists, risk management, pharmacovigilance, promotion. If the product is a controlled substance, we'll ask the specialists in that area. We have patient labeling reviewers. The bolded items here are labeling specialists. I'm part of the labeling policy team, noticed in yellow. So a lot of people working on labeling. So to continue, if the applicant is, if the application is acceptable for approval and there's an agreement between the FDA and the company on the wording in the labeling, the FDA approves the application. We attach the approved labeling to the letter, the approval letter that is posted publicly on Drugs at FDA. And obviously, we notify the applicant. We upload the prescribing information to Drugs at FDA. Drugs at FDA provides information on approved labeling. Also, we ask the company within 14 days of approval to submit an electronic version of the labeling in what we call structured product labeling. And that is posted on several different websites, such as FDA Label, Daily Med. Sometimes the companies also may post that version on their website, their product website. So as I stated earlier, at the time of approval, it's not finished potentially, meaning that an applicant may submit a new supplement for a new use or new safety information, and we may work to update the labeling. The FDA also may contact the company to ask for the company to submit a supplement to revise the labeling, and under certain circumstances, we may require the applicant to update the prescribing information. This is called FDA's safety labeling changes, and these are situations when there's a serious adverse reactions that are new, that are already not informed in the labeling. So with respect to updating labeling, we recommend guidance of the applicant at least review annually information in labeling. Typically, they do this more often. They have their surveillance programs about their products, and they let us know if they detected a new safety signal. And when they ask to update safety information in labeling, as I stated earlier, there's a requirement to update labeling if there's new information that can cause labeling to become inaccurate, false, or misleading. This is in our regulations and the law, the statute. We do encourage labeling updates all the time. So for example, if an applicant submits a new safety information in the warnings precautions section, but we see other items that could be updated, we take that opportunity to update the labeling. Other efforts, as I stated earlier, we believe that PLR format is a better communication tool than old format labeling. Thus, we encourage voluntary PLR conversions. As I stated earlier, we have over 250 approved voluntary PLR conversions. We train staff on how to review and develop labeling. We also publish guidances, our current thinking about what we think about a labeling topic. We also do look at labeling across the board. Are we being inconsistent? How can we be consistent Do we need to develop a policy? Do we need to write a guidance to improve consistency? And we also do public outreach about labeling. We work on a big part of our time. We work with application holders, drug companies about updating labeling, about specific applications and supplements. We also are informed by some research that's done. I quoted some research in the footnote. So in this specific situation, we asked, there were interviews, around 45-minute interviews with 70 physicians. 35 of them were generalists. 35 of them were specialists about certain items in the labeling. How do they interpret the labeling? The certain words that we use, certain formats, certain contents. So that we seek information from the public. And then finally, we provide labeling resources to the public. So specific content in the prescribing information, as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 parts of the prescribing information. The first part is called the highlights of prescribing information. And this is the critical information needed to use the drug safely and effectively. When PLR was developed in the 1990s and the early 2000s, a big ask from stakeholders is to have a brief summary of the critical information needed to use the drug safely and effectively in a half page. So you squeeze in the most critical information. I should point out a few things. We include what we call a product title, which are key identifiers for the drug, the proprietary name, the non-proprietary name, the dosage form, and route of administration, if they're not included in the non-proprietary name, and the controlled substance symbol if it's a controlled substance. The initial use approval is the 4-digit year that the new molecular entity, the new biological product, or the combination of ingredients was approved. Under the indications of usage heading, we include what we call the established pharmacological class. So this could be something like a beta blocker or an ACE inhibitor or an ARB or an opioid. And part of this is we have all these new proprietary names, and a healthcare practitioner may not be familiar with the proprietary name or the non-proprietary name, but by including the established pharmacological class, they'll say, oh, it's an ARB, it's an ACE inhibitor, it's antibacterial, it's aminoglycoside. I understand more about the global class. I'm a little bit more familiar with that. Also moving along under the adverse reactions heading, we include a statement about how healthcare practitioners could contact the FDA about suspected adverse events. They could contact the company or contact the FDA directly. If the company receives such reports, they're required to notify the FDA. And this is part of our pharmacovigilance program and the company's pharmacovigilance program. At the end of the highlights, we include what we call the revision date, and that represents the month and the year that any wording in the prescribing information was changed. So to give you an idea about the last time the prescribing information was updated. The next part is the table of contents, which is self-explanatory. I should note that this is in structured product labeling files. These are hyperlinks. So if you want to know about the mechanism of action, you could click that and go to subsection 12.1, the mechanism of action. I should also note that the way it's laid out, if you look at sections 12, 13, and 14, those are the data sections. So it's a lot of data. And the earlier sections, like sections 1, 2, 4, 5, are more about the conclusionary statements, what to do, recommendations. So first are generally the recommendations, and later are the data. Here are the sections of the full prescribing information. There are up to 18 sections if you include the box warning. Again, generally ordered in accordance to clinical importance. I'm going to focus on the highlighted sections of labeling: box warning, warnings, precautions, adverse reactions, drug abuse and dependence, and the overdose sections of labeling. Box warning. So according to our guidance, it's ordinarily used when an adverse reaction is so serious in proportion to its potential benefit. If there's a serious adverse reaction that can be prevented or reduced in frequency, if you could do something about it, or if the drug is under restricted distribution, something called a REMS, specifically an ATASU and elements to assure safe use. So these are drugs that potentially would not be approved without potentially restricted distribution. A classic case is isotretinoin capsules. Formerly, the name Accutane is a name that you may recognize, but isotretinoin capsule products are under a REMS, and there are certain requirements for pharmacists, patients who receive the drug, as well as healthcare practitioners to use the drug safely and effectively. With respect to the box warning, if you have a box warning, more of the details are in other parts of the label. So the box warning is really more of a summary statement. It does include all the information about that clinically significant adverse reaction or contraindication. And as I stated earlier, box warnings are also known as a black box warning. So moving on to the warnings and precautions section, section 5. So these are clinically significant adverse reactions or risks. It's not all adverse reactions, but those that are clinically significant. And one of the things that we always look at is when should an adverse reaction, something in section 6, the adverse reaction section, also be included in section 5? When is it clinically significant? And here are some of the considerations. If it's serious, and we have a regulatory definition of serious, something that leads to hospitalization, something that's life-threatening or leads to death, something that you could do something about it, the stronger the evidence of causality. We also factor in the seriousness of the treated condition. There are different, you could think, for example, if you have a drug for fibromyalgia versus a drug for metastatic cancer, there's a slightly different threshold for including a clinically significant adverse reaction. So, for example, with a life-threatening condition, you're going to likely treat through adverse reactions, and you'll have a higher threshold potentially to include something in the warnings and precautions. However, if it's fibromyalgia, you're going to have a lower threshold for including that. The higher the incidence of the adverse reaction makes it more likely that you include it in the warnings and precautions section. The FDA also may include a warning in the warning and precautions section if there's a clinically significant adverse reaction associated with unapproved use, and it's commonly prescribed. The subsection title, we would like it to be something that is something bad. So we use the term, for example, embryo-fetal toxicity versus pregnancy. So this slide presents the elements that we recommend and or require to be included in the warnings and precautions section. We describe the clinically significant adverse reaction or risk. We say what happens to these patients, what can you do about it, is there an incidence or rate, and then, so what can you do about it, steps to prevent, reduce, or monitor the risk. Moving on to another section, section 6, the adverse reactions. And here I present the regulatory definition of an adverse reaction, which is essentially something untoward or undesirable that's reasonably associated with the drug with a possible causal relationship to the drug. So what we try not to include are untoward events that have no possible relationship to the drug. So for example, if a patient is taking a drug or a treatment in a clinical study and they get hit by a bus and there's no evidence of delirium or a reason for them to fall in front of the bus, that's not something we want to include in labeling. If you see, for example, a drug associated with, in the trials, diarrhea, constipation, hypernatremia, hyponatremia, bradycardia, tachycardia, hypercalcemia, hypocalcemia, there's something suspicious there. Like, how could a drug cause both of those phenomenon. And sometimes that happens with drugs. You get initial tachycardia, then you get bradycardia later on, and that's important to include. But when you see that those types of things, you get suspicious, and you don't want to include things that are not likely related to the drug. Typically, we organize information in this section depending upon the source of the information. If it comes from clinical studies, we include it in the clinical trials experience subsection. If it comes from spontaneous reports, um, we include that in the post-marketing experience subsection because they're different types of data. We generally avoid terms like adverse events, and we try to include the term adverse reactions for consistency. Moving on to section 9, the drug abuse and dependence section of labeling. So we recognize that certain terms are used interchangeably. And we thought that it was very important to define these terms, what we mean, because drugs could be associated with abuse, but not physical dependence. Similarly, there are drugs associated with physical dependence. For example, beta blockers are associated with physical dependence, or SNRIs, but they're not associated with abuse. So beta blockers, as you know, after you take them for a long period of time and stop them abruptly, you could have a withdrawal syndrome. However, they're not controlled substances that are abused. However, that a lot, again, as I stated, these are used interchangeably. So we wanted to provide definitions, and specifically when a drug, for example, is misused, and we have data to support that, we include the definition of use to tell healthcare practitioners what we mean about misuse. So with respect to controlled substances, if a drug is controlled under the Controlled Substance Act, we have a specific recommended statement. So we're talking about the proprietary name contains active ingredient, a controlled to controlled substance. And we recommend that specific format. So sometimes we have information about the drug. We may have negative abuse information or negative dependence information. So for example, if the drug, if it's a new drug, and it's thought that it could be abused, but there were studies that were done that showed that we really didn't see abuse potential in the drug, we would likely include information under the abuse subsection that we studied it and there's no evidence that it was abused. But because we have it in this section, we want to be very clear that the drug is not a controlled substance. So this would be the construct we recommend in the abuse and dependence section of labeling, section 9. So let's go through a drug. If there's a drug associated with abuse, I know this is a busy slide, but let's go one by colored. So if the drug is abused, we include the abuse definition in the labeling, the first part. So the definition, as we recommended in the guidance, abuse is the intentional, non-therapeutic use of a drug, even once, for its desirable psychological or physiological effects. That's number one. Number two, we include the abuse associated adverse reactions. That's in red, that follows. And then we must, if known, include the susceptible patient populations. So green, I'm highlighting those who are higher risk for this specific abuse. I should mention that obviously drugs have different abuse dependence, obviously opioids, benzos, certain muscle relaxants, certain anti-seizure drugs, testosterone. The abuse information may be different, but the definition should be the same. Moving on to physical dependence, again, breaking it down one by one. If you have drugs associated with dependence, we recommend including the dependence definition, and you could see in blue, that's the dependence definition that we recommend. If we also want to summarize, well, what we see, what's the withdrawal syndrome like? Withdrawal specifically after stopping the drug abruptly, or decreasing, for example, the dosage abruptly. And then the red, you could see below in the example, we provide that information. And then finally, our regulations stay, what do we do about it? What can we do to mitigate it or to treat the patient who has physical dependence? In this situation, we're recommending a slow taper, and we refer people to the dosage and administration section of labeling for the detailed instructions about how to taper. So overdosage section of labeling, there are many requirements that I've listed here. One is to include the signs, symptoms, laboratory findings, and complications of overdosage, um, concentrations of the drug and fluids associated with toxicity, physiological variables influencing excretion, uh, dose response information, the amount of drug that's ordinarily associated with the symptoms of overdose, as well as the amount of drug that's likely to be life-threatening, whether the drug is dialyzable, and then what do you do about it? So general treatment measures. Um, as you know, we don't have many antidotes. Obviously, we have flumazenil for benzodiazepines, uh, um, flumazenil. It said flumazenil for benzodiazepines. We have naloxone for opioids, and there are a few others. But if we antidotes, we want to include this information. We want the standards for treatment to be qualified. So we're not going to put anything in section 10 about treatment procedures. And then we generally um, um, ask folks to consider not including information about unapproved dosages. So, for example, in this situation, let's say the drug is dosed 10 milligrams once a day, but in early explorations of the drug, they studied up to 400 milligrams because they were doing exploration. However, but it's approved at 10 milligrams. Um, we generally don't include such information because maybe only 1 or 2 patients receive 400 milligrams. And usually for a safety evaluation, we want patients to receive a certain number of patients to receive the drug for a certain period of time, a certain number at 6 months, a certain number at a year to see the overall safety profile. Generally, we recommend folks to consider not including the numbers to patients experiencing overdosage because that changes all the time, and the labeling takes time to update the labeling. So prescription drug labeling resources. I include the links below. This is our main labeling resource, prescription drug labeling resources. We're actually changing this and hopefully we'll have um, the new information posted. We're going to have a dedicated page for healthcare practitioners. Right now, most of the information here is for industry folks, but we're going to have a frequently asked questions for healthcare practitioners as well as for patients. We have prescription drug labeling resources, over 150 labeling resources for different types of prescription drug labeling, such as the prescribing information, FDA approved labeling, carton container labeling. We have specific resources for generic drugs, biological products. We also have information for structured product labeling developers on here. This is a key labeling database, drugs at FDA. This is where we post our last approved labeling. We also include reviews. So this is how FDA decided on approved drugs. We don't post information about applications that are not approved for proprietary reasons. But when we approve a drug, we provide the rationale, the summary basis of approval, why we approve the drug and why we approve those claims. Some of these, it could be 200 pages or 300 pages from all those experts that I talked about before. This is a fantastic labeling search database. This is similar to NIH's Daily Med. It's got a lot of functionality. So you could search by, I think you're probably looking for human prescription drugs. You could also look for over-the-counter drugs. You could search by application types. You can put in the proprietary name of the drug, the non-proprietary name of the drug. You could do a full labeling search or look for certain sections, information, certain sections of the labeling. By the way, this contains nearly 150,000 structured product labeling files. It's a little broader than human prescription drugs. It's got animal non-prescription drugs and over-the-counter drugs for animals, cosmetics, medical devices, dietary supplements, homeopathics. But you can filter that out if you're looking for only human prescription drugs. So let me stop there. We can take questions.
So there are 2 questions in the chat at the moment.
Oh, okay, great.
I've
Thank
had
you.
several too. So the first one is, are pharmacies required to give patients the patient package insert always and without exception? Are there penalties for not doing so even in an isolated case?
Great question. So we have over 100 approved patient package inserts. The majority of patient package inserts are not, there's no required dispensation. There's no dispensation requirements. There's only dispensation requirements for the ones approved under the animal rule. There are about 10 of those. The ones, if they, so that would be, I think, Cipro, Levaquin, the radiopharmaceuticals have those. There are very few of those. And those, the birth control pills, the contraceptives with estrogen, besides that, there are no distribution requirements. Good question about consequences. I don't know that. That's a good question about consequences for the pharmacist if they don't do that, for the ones that are required.
Comment just a little tiny bit more on the Cipro fluoroquinolone issue. Is that because of the tendinopathy and all of that, or why is that particular class of drugs required to be dispensed like that, or have a the label go?
That's a great question. So that and I would have to look about Cipro if they have a medication. I should also say that drugs may have a medication guide because there's a serious risk, and if they do that, they have to the distribution dispensation requirements apply. So that would be required, and I could look that up if Cipro does have that, or Levaquin has that. If a product does have a PPI under that, Cipro could have. They also, because of the animal rule, Cipro is approved for, I believe, anthrax, treatment of anthrax, and because of that, they would be required. So, but it could be 2 reasons. It could be the Cipro has a box warning for the tendinopathy, so they could have a medication guide because of that, or they could have it because of their specific approval in anthrax.
Interesting. Thank you. Okay, so the next question, is it still the position of the FDA that the package insert does not establish or imply a practitioner's standard of care? Is that, and then where do you locate that information? Is that information on the FDA's website at fda.gov?
A good question. So the prescribing information, as I stated earlier, represents a summary of the scientific information needed to use the drug safely and effectively by the healthcare practitioner, and is based upon the submitted data. Does it reach that standard of evidence? So it doesn't contain all the information and labeling. And generally, we don't include practice of medicine information, labeling, or textbook information. So for example, if you have a product approved for hospital-acquired pneumonia, we don't have paragraphs and paragraphs about how to diagnose or the broad spectrum treatment for hospital-acquired pneumonia. We're not talking about appropriate practices for ventilator management, or if you have a patient on asthma who's taking asthma, let's say it's a certain drug for treatment of asthma, you're going to talk about the safe and effective use of the asthma drug. You're not talking about asthma management. For example, if you're managing the patient and there's a GERD component, treating GERD, that's not part of the labeling. Or, for example, if you have a drug for hypertension, you're not talking about lowering your salt intake or reducing weight if applicable, reducing alcohol intake, um, which is part of practice in medicine. That's not part of it.
Thank you. And then I have a question. If there are situations when a drug has recently been approved and is on the market, where there's maybe some post-marketing surveillance that's got a signal um, associated with it, but it's not definitive yet. There are trials that are ongoing. Is there a mechanism for labeling something along those lines that where there's, for example, I guess maybe I'm thinking about, for example, telithromycin when it came out on the market. It was early days, but then it got followed, and then it wound up there wound up being a black box warning, and then eventually it got withdrawn. So, how does is there any way of reflecting that kind of thing on a label?
That's
Does
a
that
great
make sense?
question. No, that does make a lot of sense, and that's a great question. So, one of the first steps would be we have different types of early communication. So if we see a signal that we're evaluating, a potential signal we're evaluating, we may send an early communication outside the labeling to the public. And we have different distribution channels. As you know, sometimes we evaluate a signal, but we don't believe there's a causal relationship, and we will not include that in the labeling. Sometimes we do have different streams of data, and maybe we have some completed studies or some interim analyses, and we may feel there's enough data to make updates to the labeling. However, when there's additional data that comes in, maybe the study's finalized, then we may make subsequent updates. So really, it really depends upon the amount of data the quality of the data that we have, and the quality of the reports that we have that's submitted. I mean, the goal is to try to update the labeling when it meets that standard, it all depends upon the type of data that we have. But we could do it in two steps. We could sometimes we have information that we put in the labeling. We have the reverse, that sometimes we put a box warning in the labeling, and there's studies that are done post-marketing, and we didn't see the signal, so we will remove the box warning, and we've done that in several situations as well.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. Now, if you have, let's say eh, you have a situation where two countries have differing opinions about what should be labeled and what should be not. Is there a way of harmonizing the information on the label so the findings that you have in the United States will apply in Canada or the EU or Latin America? Or
I think that's a great question. I mean, one thing to point out is that um, our regulations, it's the US regulations and our guidances, uh, our regulations are only applicable to US prescribing information, and the regulations and our statute, the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, Public Health Service Act, our two main acts, are applicable to US labeling, and Canada, Japan, the EU may have different standards. Number two, with guidances, we do have guidances that are most of our guidance are as FDA specific. However, we do have for the labeling guidance, they're usually FDA specific. For other areas with ICH, so we have the same recommendations across the board. Um, so sometimes there may be differences because there's different standards across. We generally our concentration is usually on FDA approved labeling, so we generally don't harmonize information across the board. However, sometimes we do look at other labeling in other areas. Um, um, Companies usually submit information across the board. Um, occasionally there are some different scientific opinions about things. So obviously that's challenging from the global perspective. I mean, our primary concern are U.S. Healthcare practitioners, and most importantly, the patients who take the drugs or their caregivers who caregivers of those patients.
I'm trying to get unmuted. Do any other countries look at US labels and decide that that's what they want to use as well or do they tend to do their own labeling?
I think that's a fantastic question, and I would love to know the answer to that. I know obviously the EUA, Canada, Japan have their own labeling. I don't know if some of the countries that have smaller regulatory agencies look at our labeling. That is a fantastic question. That's a good question to folks in the drug industry. Yeah, if I figure out that question, I will email this group and tell them. But that's a good question. I don't know if anyone here is connected to the pharmaceutical industry and knows the answer to that question.
I can ask and see if I can find from the Bayer folks if they have that information. They have
And
information.
I'll seek that out too to see some of my contacts in industry. Yeah.
And then I think that we're going to get maybe this question and then maybe one more if we have time. We'll see.
Sure.
This is within that same vein. Does the FDA interact with poison centers for the purposes of pharmacovigilance and post-marketing surveillance, or do they query the national poison data system if they're trying to, get an idea of whether or not you need to develop a black box warning or anything like that? If you're in early days, do you know how that they go
So
about that?
so interactions with the group and then query. I think it's both. I mean, definitely query. I've seen data from that's used a lot. I think it's both. Um, um, I work on more of the communication side. Other folks we work with the folks data, people who actually look at the data. So I think the answer to that is both.
And then last but not least, could you point us in the direction of where you could find differences in how OTC products are labeled versus pharmaceutical prescription products? Is there a big difference in that labeling? I saw on your slide that you could, look up stuff, but is there a marked difference in how they're labeled?
It's a great question. They're hugely different. I mean, number one, the audience is totally different. With over-the-counter products, non-prescription products, the consumer has to self-select the product, so they have to there's a whole to get a drug. If a user can't self-select that they need to take the product, it's not there. They're written on these small areas. It uses directions in consumer-friendly language. They don't include clinical trials. They won't include extensive drug interaction information or use in specific population information. We have prescribing information. They're over 100 pages long. They're usually 20 pages to 40 pages. The drug facts labeling, what we call it, is usually this size. So we're talking about the amount of information, the audience is very different. They're regulated under different regulations. So they're very different.
And there are two more quick questions.
Sure.
One is, has a box warning ever been removed based on newer studies? And the second is there a way to query the FDA to look into restrictions or outright bans on supplements that are approved in other countries that could be causing harm? I've seen a few cases of Tianatine bought at gas stations. It's been banned at the state level in a few states. So ways to query the FDA database about substances that are in other countries that are causing harm, and have black boxes ever been removed on newer studies?
Great. So the answer to the first question, box warnings have been removed. I would say most of them have not, but there are several examples. There was an advisory committee meeting. We've had several advisory committee meetings. Chantix is an example where the box warning was removed. I believe the LABAs, ICS, the long-acting beta agonists, and the inhaled corticosteroid box warning was removed. Sometimes box warnings are the safety information is it, uh, it this is obviously not in technical terms, not as scary. So the concerns are less. So potentially wording is changed to that effect. So we have had some examples. I think you have a good question. The second question is a good question about supplements. So obviously I work with prescription drugs that are approved by the FDA. We have a whole dietary supplement group in FDA. Generally, they're on a totally different regulatory scheme. Dietary supplements do not have to be approved; they can be marketed. And I think it's under I think it's the DSHEA Act. It's a law. Um, and we generally, and I think we said this in guidance, do not interact unless we have cases of harm. Certainly, if you've seen that, you can welcome to contact the FDA, and we can get that to those appropriate folks so we can investigate that. The FDA will take action if there's harm from these products, but it's a different regulatory scheme based upon a law passed by Congress.
Well, that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you very much, Dr. Brodsky. This was really, really informative, and we really enjoyed it, the talk. We hope to see you all again at the next webinar, and have a very great afternoon.
You're welcome. Bye. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.